Landmines, rifle scopes, medical kits, and ammo magazines are all things that action-heavy games tend to take for granted and oversimplify in an effort to streamline the gameplay experience and not bog the player down in minutiae and nuance. This is understandable from a programmer's perspective, but also leads games to get things wrong about how these tools work. Night vision goggles don't really work in real life the way they do in Metal Gear Solid. Just like diving into a pile of hay from the top of a building wouldn't really turn out nearly as well as it does in Assassin's Creed games. That said, one thing that action games have indeed oversimplified to the point of utter madness is the silencer or suppressor. Firearm suppressors, also called sound moderators, are devices that attach to the muzzle of a compatible firearm in an effort to reduce the acoustic intensity of the muzzle report, aka the sound of the gunfire, as well as the muzzle flash when a gun is discharged. As such, they are quite useful in military situations and have been a major part of soldiers and special operations forces getting their work done with optimal efficiency. This, of course, makes them a pretty obvious tool to include in video games about such things, and they are often, but pretty much every game that does gets some things wrong about them. With that, here's just 5 of the many things that video games get wrong about silencers. First and foremost, silencers aren't generally even called silencers by people who actually use them in real life. They are much more commonly referred to as suppressors or sound moderators, as I mentioned earlier. To be fair, some games have gone the extra mile by calling them suppressors, like Metal Gear Solid, and that does add to a tone of authenticity to those games, but generally speaking, games do call them silencers, and it's just not accurate. While silencing something does sound a lot cooler than suppressing it or moderating it, that's just not how it's officially described, nor would it even be accurate if it was, as bringing total silence to something as loud as a firearm is pretty much impossible to actually do, which brings us to the next thing video games get wrong about them. Silencers don't actually silence weapons. While they certainly can reduce the sound and muzzle flashes that guns make, bringing these things to zero is pretty much impossible, and you're certainly not going to get away with shooting off a silenced round without somebody on the other side of the room hearing it. Think about what guns do to propel a bullet as fast and as hard as they do. When that hammer hits the back of a bullet, it's creating a literal explosion. The only reason guns are able to make anything useful out of that explosion is because their barrels are forcing all the thousands of pounds of pressure per square inch into a single channel, which is why bullets are so much more deadly than a knife or an arrow. They have thousands of pounds of pressure caused by an explosion behind them. To understand the gravity of what that means for how firearms work is to understand that there is basically no feasible way to totally silence them while using them out in the field. The silencer basically works by being an extension of the gun's default barrel and giving the explosion more room to explode, thus keeping more of that explosion from happening outside of the gun, where we can see it and hear it. Different silencers accomplish this in different ways, but that's more or less the idea. This is why it does make some progress towards dampening the sound and hiding some of the flash. Some silencers even make considerable gains in this area by lowering the decibel level of the gunfire by more than 50%, but less than half of extremely loud is still pretty loud. While it is true that some advanced models are currently in the works that try to generate an anti-phase auditory signal along with the gunshot, kind of like what noise-canceling headphones do, but even if that were to be perfected, that's not even counting the sound made by the hammer of the gun slamming down, the ballistic crack of the bullets flying through the air at supersonic speeds, or the sound of the impact of the bullet on its target makes. These are all things that produce sound, and even the best suppressors have no agency over them. So, when you shoot an enemy combatant in Hitman 2 with a silenced pistol while all the other guards in the area continue on with their business as if nothing ever happened, just know that's not how it works. Game ruined, 0 out of 10. Another thing that many games still get wrong about silencers is the fact that they can randomly break down for a multitude of reasons. While it is true that some games do try to reflect this by having silencers break down and get discarded, especially many newer games, even those games are sort of wrong too, as they don't always break down. It's commendable that many games do try to be realistic by essentially giving silencers their own health bar, but that's not really how it works. The lifespan of a silencer isn't totally dependent on how it's used, how frequently it's used, or what sort of weapon it's used for. It's a combination of all three of those elements, as well as others, that can differ from silencer to silencer, as every controlled explosion in the barrel of a silencer is going to be somewhat different from the last. That makes every gunshot unique. Heat might be concentrated in a different spot. Microscopic differences in the bullets might cause wear and tear on different areas of the barrel. Various welds will pop off. Materials fatigue and become unthreaded at different rates. And while most suppressors will generally break one day, it's hard to say exactly when, why, and where it'll happen until it does. And that makes it pretty tough to measure the impact on a silencer from a gun with any degree of certainty. The best way to truly illustrate this in a game would be to totally randomize the death of silencers. And I want to say there might be a couple of games that do that, but largely speaking, that's not how games handle it. Here's another thing that might ruin the immersion of stealth games that use silencers for you. Silencers are kind of a pain to use and require lots of TLC and practice to mount them correctly. And that's even assuming you have the correct compatibility between your weapon and the suppressor in question in place. Every time you see Sam Fisher or Agent 47 pick up a random silencer they found in a box somewhere and just screw it onto their gun, you're watching an incredibly inaccurate portrayal of what it's like to properly mount a suppressor. Depending on the model of suppressor and weapon, most silencers require extra tools to successfully apply to a compatible barrel. And even then, many firearms also require the user to take the gun apart to a degree to properly modify it in this way. While some specialized military weapons do exist with simplified suppressor application in mind, even they often have adapters and extra steps involved to make sure it's done correctly. If even the smallest part of mounting a suppressor is mishandled by haphazard work, it can mean the end of the silencer, the firearm, and even the user of the weapon in no time. Last but not least is the fact that silencers are not cheap, and therefore not just laying around in enemy encampments for the heck of it. Whenever Big Boss rummages around in a hostile outpost and comes across a $1,200 suppressor for his SMG, that's about as likely as him hitting the lottery. As I imagine running an evil paramilitary group is quite expensive, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to just have expensive equipment lying around that isn't currently in use. Odds are, if a group of soldiers have suppressors out in the field, they're probably using them. And even when games only give you silencers upon killing enemies that have them, even then, we run into the previously mentioned issues of compatibility and all the work that mounting them properly takes. Work that probably won't be doable in the middle of a combat mission. So, while silencers are definitely cool to have in games, and I would never want them to not be there, it's still interesting to note how so many games oversimplify them to such a comical degree. Like most things that games gloss over, it's generally because they want to keep the player focused on the more exciting parts of the experience, and not toiling around with wrenches, adapters, oils, and metal threads for 30 minutes just to put on a silencer. So it's not a bad thing for the sake of the experience, but it's always interesting to note just how different small things in games and reality can be. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed and would like to see more, feel free to hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to ensure you'll be notified when new videos go up.